Good evening, traveler. Or rather, peasant. The one in the wool tunic that hasn't been washed in weeks. Because, well, neither has anything else. Tonight, we're stepping quietly, not boldly, into one of the most overlooked, most uncomfortable, and most thoroughly disgusting aspects of pre-modern life. Using the bathroom in the Middle Ages. You may imagine knights and castles, torchlit halls, and feasting tables piled high. But beneath those stone walls, behind those thick castle doors, and even inside the peasant's thatched cottage, lurked something far more sinister than a dragon or invader. Waste, the cockerel crows, and smoke curls lazily from a few hearts. There is no sewage system to speak of. That depends on who you are and where you live. They did this at night, often working by candlelight in suffocating, disease-ridden conditions. They were banned from socializing with other tradespeople and often lived on the outskirts of town. But oddly enough, they were paid well. No one wanted the job, and desperation has always had a price. This was the era of miasma theory, the belief. The disease spread through foul air. And indeed, medieval towns reeked, but the response was not to remove the waste. Instead, people masked the smell with flowers, herbs, or incense. You still have a full day of exposure, contaminated food, and no real way to clean yourself. Diarrhea, dysentery. Colorothies weren't rare events. They were daily risks, especially for children. Infant mortality rates were staggering, and so much of it came down to one simple thing: sanitation. In a few large cities and monasteries, communal latrines did exist, or that monasteries had latrine areas that required monks to defecate in total silence while maintaining a prayerful mindset. And if they did, it was in public bathhouses, which themselves became breeding grounds for lice and disease. You've emptied the chamber pot, stepped over or threw the muck in the road, and managed not to faint from the smell. Congratulations. But the question remains, how long would you last? The idea of washing hands after relieving oneself was virtually non-existent. Even among the elite, these were often just benches with holes cut into them, suspended over a pit or a running stream. If you were lucky, the current took things away. If not, the pit had to be cleaned periodically, usually by gong farmers. Perhaps one of the most unfortunate professions in medieval society. Rainwater, blood from butcher shops, spoiled vegetables, rotting carcasses, animal dung, and, of course, human excrement form a slow-moving, foul-smelling stream along the cobbled road. Your shoes are a little more than leather wraps. You feel every stone and every squid. You awaken on your straw, mattress scratchy, flea-infested, and only a few inches off the dirt floor. Maybe you're in a cottage with your entire family. Maybe a chicken or goat shares the space. And like every human being, you feel the need to relieve yourself. But many castle privis were garubza, simple hole in a seat that opened directly over the outer wall, or a shaft descending to the moat below. In theory, this meant your waste would fall into running water and be washed away. In practice, it meant that your waste either pooled in the moat or was collected at the castle base. Guards stationed below would often complain of the smell, and would sometimes construct angled stone slabs to direct falling waste away from them. Human waste, animal waste, food waste, chamber pots, sloshing and overflowing, and the near total absence of sanitation. There's no toilet paper at best. You might use straw, moss, or even a scrap of fabric if you're lucky. In poorer homes, the family shared what was known as a gompstick, a kind of communal wiping device. It was kept in a bowl of water and reused by everyone. Yes, you heard that correctly. The modern concept of a bathroom is just that. Instead, you'll likely reach for a chamber pot, a small bowl, or a jug placed beneath the bed. It's already half full. It was used during the night. There's no lid. There's no flush. You do your business, and now you have a new problem. What to do with it? Let's set the scene. It's dawn in a medieval village. You or perhaps your youngest child or servant would open the front door and toss the contents directly into the street. That's not an exaggeration. The phrase "Gardyloo," shouted in some cities like Edinburgh, was a warning that waste was about to come raining down from an upper-story window. The word is believed to have originated from the French "garde," L-O. Watch out for the water. Only, it wasn't water. But you can't just walk to the restroom, because the restroom doesn't exist. The solution in most villages and towns was known, euphemistically, as slop disposal. Now, let's consider a city. Imagine yourself in London or Paris during the 1300s. The streets are narrow. The buildings lean in like old gossiping crones. So why not go to a public latrine, you ask? Gong farmers were paid to dig out cesspits, sometimes several feet deep, filled with decomposing human waste. In castles, things weren't much more elegant. The term privy sounds genteel, doesn't it? Now imagine it's winter. The stone seat of the garderobe is ice cold. The connection between human waste and sickness wasn't fully understood, but people knew that bad smells were dangerous. Perhaps the most telling detail is this. Medieval people, across classes, rarely bathed. So let's say you've survived your morning routine, because this was just the morning. By the way, did I mention that wealthy people often reused sponges soaked in vinegar as a kind of reusable wipe? But we'll get to that later, because for now, let's pause with this question. Let's pick up where we left off, just outside your medieval home, or perhaps outside the castle walls ankle deep, in a mixture of rainwater and filth. The sun's barely overhead, and already the day smells like rot. Now imagine that it's your job to dive beneath the surface of that stench. Not metaphorically, literally. Let's talk more about the gong farmer, that curious, almost comical title masking one of the most horrendous jobs in medieval society. In larger cities, they often hauled the material out in carts or barrels, which were then transported to Laysdale's dumps on the outskirts of town. Occasionally, this waste was sold to farmers as fertilizer. Yet, ironically, they were vital to urban life. Without them, medieval towns would have drowned in their refuse. In places like London, the role became so essential that some gong farmers were employed by the city corporation, paid handsomely, and given legal protections, though not social respect. Others developed fire-damp methane gases that could explode if a flame was introduced. Still others were simply too deep or compacted, and laborers were overcome by fumes before they could finish. Yes, human excrement as fertilizer, the nitrogen-rich compost, may have been good for the soil, but the risk of disease lingered like the odor. They advised noble households to locate toilets away from bedrooms, and some castles built elaborate shafts to vent air away from living quarters. Still, the risk remained. Many aristocrats died of flux, a vague term covering dysentery, food poisoning, and other digestive misfortunes that were often worsened by poor sanitation. In some Islamic regions, it was religiously mandated to use the left hand for cleaning, and a rite for eating an etiquette still echoed in parts of the world today. But regardless of the tool, most methods were not hygienic. Shared items were rarely washed. Diseases passed quickly. These weren't necessarily clean, just relocated. Animals often rooted around in them. Every step of the process exposed you to disease, humiliation, and injury. And no matter your station, peasant or king, there was no true escape from it. To some extent, they did. Monastic latrines, known as reredos, were long bench-style structures with openings suspended over a running stream. Sanitary options were nearly non-existent. Cloth rags were reused, soaked, and dried often in secret to avoid shame. During childbirth, a woman might relieve herself where she lay, with only straw beneath her. The mess was burned after were left. The Cistercians in particular were famous for their attention to water flow and cleanliness. But even here, the waste collected downstream pollutes zones and breeds illness among nearby villagers. In some regions, the concept of an earth closet existed, essentially a crude composting toilet using layers of ash or dirt to mask smell. It was an improvement, but not a solution. Medieval people didn't necessarily smell filth anymore, they lived in it. It was the norm. It wasn't until centuries later, with advances in chemistry, engineering, and public health, That waste was truly recognized as the silent killer. It was, maybe you committed a crime, and this was your punishment. At the bottom, your feet press into a floor that feels slightly spongy and warm in places. You cannot breathe through your nose. The ammonia burns your throat, and yet you begin scooping. The sludge slops against the bucket. Flies buzz like static. Above you, the night is still, but in the pit, it feels like a different world entirely. It's nighttime. You stand in the lantern-lit alley behind a large tenement house. The air is heavy with damp. The pit in front of you hasn't been emptied in over a year. The landlord wants it done before sunrise. You're given a rope, a bucket, and a ladder. The word gong comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go, as in to go to the toilet. A large cesspit in a city in or monastery might take days to empty. The sludge was thick, semi-solid, and packed with more than just waste clumps of hair, rotten food, broken pottery, and sometimes bones. And when the pits were old enough or deep enough, the oxygen-deprived conditions preserved all kinds of strange finds. Archaeologists today are fascinated by these medieval waste layers because they tell us what people really ate, wore, and threw away. And farmer in this context doesn't refer to tilling the fields, but rather to someone who farms out a service doing a contracted job for a town or noble estate. Gong farmers were paid to empty privy vaults, cesspits, and public latrines, often by hand. They worked primarily after dark, partly for public decency, but also because the smell was so overwhelming during the heat of the day that the task was borderline unbearable. Equipped with nothing but wooden shovels, leather aprons, and sometimes long-handled scoops, they would climb into these pits and remove layer after layer of festering waste. Now let's be clear. These were not brief, occasional cleanup jobs. Gong farmers themselves were considered unclean. Many laws restricted them from entering certain public places or mingling with others during the day. Let's imagine, for a moment, you've been sentenced to do this work. Maybe you fell into debt. You descend, slowly, carefully. Each rung was slick with moisture. If you're lucky, the job ends without injury. But not always. Some pits had collapsed, drowning workers. Let's contrast this with rural life, where chamber pots were emptied into garden corners or into open ditches called drafts. Now, you might think monasteries, centers of knowledge and order, had it figured out. Interestingly, medieval doctors and scholars were aware that bad air from latrines could cause illness. And we haven't even touched on wiping yet. In the absence of toilet paper, people used all manner of materials: moss, hay, straw, smooth stones, scraps of fabric, corn husks, and even their left hand. So now you're not only filthy and cold, but potentially sick. And the next time you get a stomachache, it could be the last. What about women, especially during menstruation or childbirth? By now, it should be clear that the act of relieving oneself in the Middle Ages was not just uncomfortable, it was hazardous. The irony. Waste was so ever-present that people stopped noticing it. The human nose, once overwhelmed, stops reacting. So here's the thought to end on tonight. Let's settle deeper now. The moon is high above your medieval town or manor. The streets have quieted. The chamber pots are full again. Somewhere in the darkness, a gong farmer is dragging a leaking barrel past shuttered windows. And you're huddled beneath your itchy blanket, wondering how anyone made it through a lifetime in a world that never knew clean water or antiseptic soap. In this final chapter, let's turn our gaze toward the long-term consequences of medieval sanitation, or, more accurately, the catastrophic effects of having none. Medieval people didn't just struggle with bad smells and minor infections. They died by the thousands of preventable diseases directly linked to the filth around them. Let's begin with the Black Death. A single poorly placed outhouse could sicken an entire household. And because the same buckets were used for multiple tasks, washing dishes, hauling waste, collecting drinking water, cross-contamination was unavoidable. Yes, it was carried by fleas on rats. But do you know where those rats lived? in cities choked with refuse, in straw-thatched roofs filled with waste. Suppose you're not a peasant, but a wealthy nobleman, or perhaps even a king. Surely, your lavatory is more dignified, in dung heaps left rotting behind every home. Filth was not merely unpleasant, it was a perfect breeding ground. It wasn't tea. Until after the worst of the plague had passed, that many towns finally began regulating where waste could be thrown. But once again, there was no flushing system. The waste had to go somewhere, often into the moat, frozen chamber pots until someone had to break the surface to use them. You know that tomorrow and the day after and the week after, you will face the same challenges. You will step over filth in the streets. You will breathe in the stench of open drains. You may fall ill. You may survive. There are recorded complaints from castle servants who had to carry night soil in the snow, slipping and cursing under their breath because everyone else is enduring it too. Some nobles even kept perfumed cloths or citrus fruits nearby to mask the ever-present stench. Bakers knead dough near open latrines. Mothers wash linens in streams that shimmer with waste. And no one blinks because this is the world they were born into. And here's the twist. Moats were rarely filled with fresh, flowing water. The Romans had used lead pipes to carry water. And in some places, these systems were rediscovered or mimicked during the medieval period. Monasteries and palaces might have rudimentary aqueducts or clay channels directing water to washing areas or latrines. But these were the exception, not the rule, and the lead often leached into the water, causing problems over time. More often, they were stagnant, and even then, the change was slow. Cities clung to their habits. It took cholera outbreaks in places like London and Paris to finally force investment in public sanitation. The very thing meant to protect the castle had become its disease trap, or requiring that cesspits be constructed at specific depths and distances from wells. In London, for example, regulations in the 14th century dictated that no latrine could be built closer than 20 feet to a neighbor's well, an improvement, but still a far cry from safety. And once the disease arrived, it spread like fire through communities that had no habit of washing, no access to clean water, and no concept of quarantine as we know it. But these channels quickly clogged, overflowed, or became stagnant. People dumped anything and everything into the manimal corpses, rotting food, rags soaked in whom, and when the rains came, the slurry flowed into homes, workshops, and even churches. Public health officials didn't yet exist. Garbage collectors weren't on payroll. Cities rarely enforced sanitation laws until the situation turned dire. Even when systems were developed, they often failed. In some cities, open sewage channels were dug along the sides of roads. In rural areas, the danger was wells, dug shallow and often uncovered, could easily become contaminated by latrines placed nearby. Now, let's pause and consider a more elite view. Well, yes and no. Royal palaces often included garderobes with elaborate vertical shafts. Some castles even built multi-level toilet towers with angled stonework designed to divert waste away from the walls. And in winter, everything froze. Frozen pipes, frozen privy chutes. If you were lucky, you might have access to an early pipe system. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries after the medieval period that the flush toilet, closed sewage systems, and germ theory truly changed the world. Now, picture yourself once again in the Middle Ages. It's night. You've lit your tallow candle. The chamber pot waits beneath your bed. But mostly, you will endure. Children play beside dung heaps. It is the dead of night. The fire in the village hearths has burned down the coals. The streets are quiet, eerily so. In the thatched homes, peasants shift in uneasy slumber under layers of wool. Someone must patrol the lanes between cottages, and along the outer palisade, there are no gas lamps, no clocks, and no warmth. Only darkness, silence, and the weight of the hours ahead. A single overturned lantern or ember from a chimney could turn a whole street into an inferno. Thieves lurked, taking advantage of the dark to rob carts, pick locks, or sneak into livestock pens. And in border regions or times of unrest, raiders from rival territories could arrive without warning. Those were rare and usually reserved for castles or major city gates. More often, your route was circular, around the edge of the town, between wooden fences and hedgerows, back and forth past the alehouse, the mill, the barns, the church, and yes, the graveyard. Someone must watch for fire, for thieves, for wolves, for the slow approach of raiders. That someone is you, the night watchman. It was a place of shifting shadows, of bones unearthed by dogs, and rumors whispered about spirits. More often, if it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you kept walking. And if a dog barked or a cart creaked nearby, you prepared yourself, though for what? Exactly, you could never say. You had no sword. You had no backup. If you encountered real trouble, your only defense was your voice, your alarm bell, and the hope someone was awake enough to hear it. These men enforced the evening curfew, a law that required all fires and lights to be extinguished after a set hour, often around 8 or 9 p.m. You might have to milk the cow, chop wood, clean your cottage. You weren't a professional. This was a duty on top of your daily survival. You didn't get days off. You just got older, colder, and more tired. Perhaps you had to check the thatched roofs for signs of smoke. Perhaps you knew that a rival village had issued threats. Or perhaps you had no clear task at all, just a vague instruction. Keep your eyes open. The goal was to reduce fire risk, but it also meant the streets became even darker. More often than not, they were elderly, poor, infirm, or socially expendable. You walked this same path over and over again until your feet ached and your lantern flickered out. No one would know if you stopped, but you didn't, because you feared what might happen if you did. The job didn't pay well if it paid at all and offered little prestige. You might have been a failed farmer, a widower, with no family, or a man too injured from past labor to do heavier work. You were chosen because you could be spared. The patrols would walk through alleys, banging sticks, or calling out the hour, 10 of the clock, and all is well. A comforting sound to those indoors, a lonely chant to the man saying it. You may not believe in ghosts, but after several nights alone, shivering with fatigue, even the wind can sound like a voice, and straw, hoping not to feel the gnawing nibble of rats or the chill from a cracked wall. But not everyone is asleep. Someone must remain awake. Tonight, you walk alone, clutching a rusted lantern and a wooden staff, pacing a route you know by heart, but cannot always see. Let us explore the little-known and often thankless world of medieval night watchmen. Those solitary figures, charged with guarding a sleeping world. Long before anyone understood shift schedules or workers' rights, in many medieval towns and villages, especially from the 12th century onward, the presence of a night watch became essential. Fires were a constant threat, so towns designated someone, sometimes a group, but often just one man, to keep vigil through the long hours between sundown and sunrise. This task was seen as necessary, but never noble. In fact, it was often a punishment, or a duty rotated among the poorer men of the town. Occasionally, criminals were assigned the role instead of serving time in jail. Imagine that your reward for petty theft is to be sent half-starved and half-frozen to patrol alone through the darkest hours of the night. If you were appointed to this job, you likely received a short staff, known in some places as a watch club. Not much good in a real fight. Maybe a bell or horn to sound the alarm, and a hooded cloak threadbare, waxed to resist rain, and smelling permanently of smoke and mold. You wouldn't have had a watchtower. Midnight in a medieval graveyard wasn't a place of peace. The watchman's duties varied. In large towns, like London, there were organized watches known as curfew patrols. In smaller villages, your job might involve watching the livestock pens or walking a circuit to ensure no gates had been left open. And who were these night watchmen? They weren't heroes. They weren't even respected, really. Imagine, now, the physical toll The cold crept into your boots and fingers. You dozed off, standing up. Hunger gnawed at your belly. In some towns, there were watch houses, small wooden huts, or sheds, where the watchman could take shelter between rounds. But these were rare, and when your shift ended, if it ended safely, you didn't go home to rest. So here's a quiet question for tonight. The town is still, but you keep moving. You've already passed the blacksmith's hut, where embers glow like forgotten eyes. The last candlelight has vanished from the alehouse window, and only the clatter of distant shutters stirs the air. Your breath fogs before you. Your joints ache, and your feet drag. The watch continues. There were the stray animals, often rabid or half rooting through refuse heaps, or pulling at laundry strung too low. There were the drunkards, tossed out from taverns after curfew, stumbling aimlessly, and sometimes violently through alleys. And there were the superstitions sensing but deeply felt. What you realize quickly in this life is that the dark is never entirely empty, not in the Middle Ages. Yes, even in Europe, wolves roamed the woods, and if you lived in a village near forest land, you'd heard stories. A child snatched, a shepherd gutted. Wolves were not symbols of fairy tales yet. They were real, gray, lean, and quiet on snow. As a night watchman, your enemies were not only thieves or fire, because you see, the medieval world was not just dark and light. It was dark in spirit, the way the wind curled around a chapel door and seemed to whisper Latin, the sound of footsteps when none should follow, because medieval life, especially at night, was steeped in the supernatural. Let's talk about fear. The kind of fear a man begins to carry like a second cloak, heavy and silent. They believed in witches, who flew or crawled through cracks to steal babies or blight cows. Not entirely, because the mind plays tricks in the dark, and after enough nights alone, you began to wonder whether something truly was watching you back. And they believed the devil himself could appear in many forms. A dog, a shadow, a handsome man in fine robes. And shadows, as you've learned, can look like anything you fear. Travelers who came too late, cloaked and hunched, seeking lodging but offering no name. The night was no time to knock on doors, because if something happens on your watch, it will be your fault. As a watchman, if you caught the glint of flame, you had to act immediately, banging on doors, ringing the town bell, shouting over and over. The cold seeps in through the soles of your feet and settles in your chest like a cough that one tea leaf. In winter, the air stings your skin until you lose the feeling in your fingers. You worry they might not come back. If neighbors noticed the smell in the morning, they would alert the authorities, but often it was the watchman who noticed first. A door ajar, a window never shuttered, a strange silence from a normally noisy house. You might knock and find nothing, or worse, find something. Bells ringing with no hand, lights flickering in empty towers, soft crying that led nowhere. If you found a body, you tied a colored cloth to the door so the morning bailiff could quarantine it. No one went inside again. Not for days. Sometimes, not ever. You walk back past the same crooked homes, the same wet streets, the same graveyard fence. But the weight of the silence has deepened. You've seen too much, heard too much, and you know it'll be the same again tomorrow night. In towns with churches, watchmen often patrolled graveyards, and there were hushed stories of things moving among the stones. It happened, not once, often. Was it a fox? Or was it the monk buried last spring, finally come to ask forgiveness? Sometimes you'd run to a well, but by the time you returned, it was too late. No fire brigade, no hoses, just leather buckets and panic. The roads vanish. The hedgerows flatten under white. Everything is muffled. You walk by memory, not by sight. You've tripped into ditches. You've walked in circles. You've fallen asleep standing, only to wake with ice in your beard and your staff, half buried in frost. And you feared the wailing, that eerie cry in the distance. There might be a fox, might be a woman in pain. You feared the wolf that might slip through the fence line. You feared strangers. You also feared fire. Perhaps more than anything, One spark on a thatched roof, and the whole street could go. Fires spread faster than people woke. But beyond all that, beyond the dangers you could, name were the ones you couldn't. The unexplained shapes in the fog. People believed in ghosts. They believed in revenants, restless corpses that returned to torment the living. As a watchman, you didn't have the luxury of disbelief. It wasn't uncommon for night watchmen to report strange occurrences. You may laugh now, but remember, you're tired, you're hungry, and you're alone. Your lantern casts long shadows. Let's not forget the weather. Your cloak isn't waterproof. Your boots are soaked. The rain has a way of finding the seams in everything: your hood, your seams, your bones. And when it snows, when it snows, ... But you don't complain. There's no one to hear, and you don't stop. Now let's add a final, unsettling truth. In many towns, the night watchman also served another function. He was the one who found the dead. In cities where disease was common, people often died in their homes during the night. Some towns even tasked the night watch with marking plague houses. Can you imagine finding a mother and child in their sleep? Both cold, both stiff, with the father already missing. And then, before you can reflect, the bell in the church tower tolls. Once you know the time, your shift is ending soon. The first light of dawn breaks gently, not brightly, over the rooftops. The mist hangs low across the ground like a shroud. It's cold enough to bite, but not enough to kill. Your shift as the night watchman is ending. You should feel relief. You should be hurrying home to sleep. But instead, you linger. No emergencies. No fires. No thieves. Just hours of walking, of listening, of waiting. And that is what makes the job unbearable. Not the danger, but the slow, quiet erosion of your spirit in the face of nothing happening. Your shift begins, as always. But midway through your route, you hear shouting. You follow it quietly, quickly, until you come upon a figure crouched beside a merchant's stall. A thief. Because the night never truly leaves you. And suddenly, your name is on parchment for all the wrong reasons. This morning is no different than the last, and no different from the one before. Let's explore what happened when things did go wrong, and that perception stuck. Even in cities with structure, the night watchman remained a half-trusted, half-forgotten figure. By the late medieval period, places like London had watchhouses, and even groups of watchmen on a rotating schedule. Your wife, or perhaps your dog, greets you with a look of pity. You take off your wet cloak. You set down the lantern. You remember walking past the same cottage 5 times, wondering each time whether someone inside had died and no one yet knew. You remember the graveyard gate that was unlatched, even though you swore it had been shut. And you try to rest, but sleep comes slow. People assume they slept well because the world was quiet, not because someone ensured it stayed that way. They complain about noise, about cold, about the occasional lost chicken butt. No one says, "Thank you for walking while we rested," because while the night is over, the memory of it clings to your skin. These were often men appointed by the town council, and were sometimes supported by apprentices or guardsmen, but their reputation never improved much. Your knees ache, but if you let him go, and he's caught later, the blame might fall on you. So you shout loud. You raise your club and give chase. Your legs betray you. Your ears ring with phantom sounds. Another man, usually younger, less broken, is chosen. He takes the staff, the cloak, the lantern. He walks the same route. He sees the same shadows. And you watch from your window, wondering whether he'll make it through the year with his mind intact. Imagine you're in a large walled town like York or Brut. Some towns required negligent watchmen to stand in the public square, wearing a sign, or worse, tied to a post for villagers to mock. You weren't just invisible at night. Became a spectacle by day. Suspicious, tired in the bones. You stop looking people in the eye. You start to forget what it was like to dream. You confront him, lantern raised, but you're alone. He runs, DJ. Can you? Your boots are worn thin. You don't catch him. In the morning, the merchant finds the stall broken. He complains to the town reeve. The reeve complains to the mayor. The mayor demands a report. There were consequences for failing as a night watchman. Fines, mostly. But also humiliation. Still, in some towns, the night watch did evolve into something more organized. In Shakespeare's time, the town watch was a source of comedy, a group of bumbling, sleepy men barely aware of their duties. Now, return to your humble village. You're home again, seated beside a hearth that barely gives warmth. You remember the barking dogs, the shifting trees, the echoing coughs in the distance. You remember fear not as a scream or a shadow, but as a slow, seeping fog that never quite lifts. And perhaps worst of all, you remember that no one thanks the watchman. You aren't praised in the morning. You aren't greeted with a warm cup of ale or a clean blanket. And so, the night begins to change you. It makes you distant. Eventually, you grow too old to do the job. The world is still dark when she wakes. There are no curtains to draw, no soft mattress to rise from, and certainly no clock to glance at. Just the ache in her back and the scratch of straw against her skin to remind her that morning has come. Though the sun has not, she is a medieval peasant woman, and her day starts before the rooster even opens its beak. She owns no land, holds no title, and cannot read or write. But without her, the village would collapse within days. Tonight, we walk a mile in her shoes, though. In truth, she likely has none. Her name is not recorded in any book. History rarely remembers women like her. Let us begin. No one speaks at this hour, unless they must. Her first motion is careful, sleeping beside Heron. The same pallet of straw and coarse linen are. Two small children, one curled like a kitten, the other hot with fever. The baby, swaddled and damp, lies beside the hearth. He eats the crust, grunts about the fence, needing mending, and heads to the field. He won't be back until dusk. Her first task is to stir the embers from last night's fire, coaxing them back into flame with twigs and careful breath. There is no chimney, just a hole in the roof. The smoke curls upward sometimes. Other times, it sits heavy in the room like fog in a cave. In a medieval village, labor was divided by necessity, not choice. Men worked in the fields with plows and oxen. Women worked everywhere else, cooking, brewing, gathering, raising children, spinning wool, patching clothes, making candles, tending gardens, feeding animals, and when needed, helping in harvest or building. Her husband, if he isn't already outside, sleeps snoring on a wooden bench. Boots still on, she doesn't wake him. If it's winter, she simply tries to keep the last of the cabbages from freezing solid. She scatters feed, crumbs and seed if she has it. One hen is limping. She notes it silently. The eggs are collected, carefully placed in a worn basket. One egg has cracked. She sighs. That's her breakfast lost. Not because they enjoyed it, but because water was unsafe. And weak ale was often the only reliable drink. She boils malt and stirs it, add in herbs. The process smells sour. She knows it must last. Her teeth hurt, but she doesn't say so. Pain is just part of the day. So are bruises. So are infections. No one asks why. She knows it must sit for hours in a cask, covered by cloth. She checks the last batch fermenting nicely. If it sours, they won't drink. If it turns out right, maybe they'll sell a few jars to neighbors. She doesn't think of seasons poetically. She thinks of them in terms of hunger. No words are spoken. It's slow, repetitive work, and must be done with care. Bad yarn means bad cloth, and bad cloth means cold children. Not because she is stoic, but because there is no one to hear it. Every other woman in the village is doing the same. Some are even worse. Off widows, beggars, or those with too many mouths to feed. The baby has soiled its rags again, and she must rinse them in the stream. Again, the laundry water is still warm, but she has no strength left to scrub more. Her back twinges when she bends. Her hands will be cracked by noon, and once they're clean, she must hang them over the hedgerow to dry if the sun cooperates. She wraps the child tighter and whispers a prayer to Saint Apollonia, or maybe to the Virgin, or maybe to no one in particular. If not, they'll stay damp for days. The children, meanwhile, are hungry again. She boils millet in a dented iron pot, adding scraps of herbs. It smells faintly of onion. It's not much. The yard is damp with dew, and the muddy path to the stream is still slick from last night's storm. Her boots are thin-soled, if she has them on. Some days, she goes barefoot. She pulls her wool shawl over her shoulder scores. Itchy, smelling faintly of smoke, and moves through the one-room cottage with the kind of quiet only necessity teaches. She draws water. Her hands are already raw, and the rope bites as she lifts the heavy load. Back home, the baby is crying, and her eldest is tugging at her sleeve, asking for bread. There is no bread yet, just a crust from 2 days ago, soaked in water to soften it. She'll choose hers quickly and without taste. Today is wash day, which means she must fetch water. She lifts a wooden bucket and steps out into the pre-dawn cold. Down to the stream she walks half a mile, perhaps more. Her husband is awake now. He says nothing. He never was a talker. And so the day begins her day. Let's pause to understand what this woman is up against. She is not merely tending to a home. She is a cornerstone of survival. There were no days off. There was no privacy. There were no servants. She must wash clothes today. That means soaking them in the stream, scrubbing them with lye soap made from ashes and fat. Her middle child is coughing now, a deep, wet sound. There is no doctor. There is no medicine. She tends the garden next. If it's spring, she plants. If it's autumn, she harvests. Next come the chickens. The day wears on. She must spin wool using a spindle and distaff. And now she must brew ale. In many medieval villages, women brewed the household ale. The sun is high now. The baby is asleep. Her arms ache, and she has not yet eaten. She takes a small piece of dried fish, salty, tough on chews slowly. And yet, through all this, she does not complain. She doesn't know the word overworked. She doesn't dream of anything different. She doesn't have time. The sun is dipping lower in the sky now. The shadows stretch longer across the yard. The breeze carries the scent of wood smoke, sheep dung, and brewing ale. They're stiff with wind and smell faintly of smoke and river. The damp ones must be rehung tomorrow, and she worries the weather might turn. If it rains, she'll have to start all over again. It is late afternoon, and her work is not finished. Not even close. The clothes she washed this morning, at least the ones that dried, must be brought inside. But there's no time to dwell on that. The evening meal must be started. She rummages through the small clay jars in the corner. Parsley, leeks, some dried beans. There's a turnip, shriveled but edible. In the pot, she stirs the remaining barley from yesterday. There are just enough calories to make it to the next sunrise. Maybe. She sits beside him, nursing her own bowl, careful to eat slowly. The children quiet down, cowed by his presence. The fire pops softly. Outside, the sun is gone. But in the medieval world, there was no such thing as an evening off. If she's lucky, there's a bit of bacon rind to toss in for flavor. The children need something warm before nightfall. And the baby, she knows, will wake again crying for milk she barely produces. Potatoes, apples, herbs, and dried meat. She sits by firelight, squinting through the dim glow, her needle poking clumsily into fabric. She doesn't have proper thread, just scraps. She's already unraveled one of the baby's blankets for string, or baked loaves for the morning market, or stripped feathers from a goose for a neighbor in trade. Her hands shake. Her stitches are uneven, but they will hold. She notes what's running low. Winter is always coming. Even in August, she thinks about February, or spin wool, the spindle bobbing steadily as she turns fleece into thread. She will scream into the night, surrounded by women, clutching a worn rope from the ceiling or pressing against a midwife's hands. And if she survives, she will get up the next day and feed the chickens. She can't read or write, but she remembers everything in her head what's been used. She lifts the baby who won't sleep. Not yet, and hums a song her own mother once sang. Soft, barely a melody. Just enough to fill the silence. Just herbs and prayers, passed down from other women. If an infection comes, it comes. Her body curls around the smallest child, one arm flung protectively over his chest. Her hair smells of smoke and onions. Her bones ache. Her breath is shallow. And yet she sleeps. If the fever takes her, it takes her. What must last? What she owes to the baker, or the miller, or the alewife. Up the road, there is always something else to do. There is no such thing as a full meal in her world. She curses softly, sets down the spoon, and runs after it barefoot through the muckabone. There is no contraception. Not reliably. She might have 10 children, or 2 living. She may have buried infants in the frozen earth, wrapped in her own shawl. Her belly may ache from a miscarriage. Her hips may still burn from her last labor, but she does not rest. A place by the fire. She speaks sharply, but not cruelly. She doesn't have the energy for emotion. The hem of her dress is already soiled, her feet slick with cold mud. The goat resists. She hauls it back, tying the latch with twine and hoping it holds until morning. As the food simmers, she takes a moment to sit by the hearth and stretch her back. It crackles with fatigue. Her hands are red, nails torn from the laundry, knuckles sore from kneading dough that didn't rise. She looks at her fingers as if they belong to someone else. He's been slaughtering today, or maybe helping with the harvest. He doesn't say. He sits heavily on the bench, pulls off his boots, and scratches behind one ear. She offers him a wooden bowl of stew, and he eats without comment. And then the goat has broken from its pen again. By now, the children are fighting over what she doesn't know. Then another noise. Her husband returns. He enters without greeting, dusted with soil, hands stained with animal blood. This is not cruelty. It is normal. Conversation is a luxury, not a ritual. Let's pause. By this time of day, a modern woman might be getting ready to rest perhaps, after a shift at work, a meal with family, or a moment of peace. After dinner, the real work began. She checks the stored food. Next, she mends socks with holes, tunics with worn elbows, bodices fraying at the seam. In some households, she might also be expected to grind grain by hand and a cornstone, rotating hour after hour to make flour. And if a family brews ale to sell, she might have to measure it into jugs for customers who arrive unannounced. She does not rest. Let's not forget her body. She's likely pregnant or has been recently, perhaps many times. Childbirth, when it comes, will happen on this same floor. There are no physicians here, but she does not speak of these fears. Instead, she wipes her hands. She tucks the children into a shared pallet near the hearth. The fire dies down. The cottage is dark again. She lies down not in comfort, but from exhaustion, because she must. The sky is still dark when she stirs again. The baby has begun to whimper hungry, cold, or both. She blinks, not quite awake, not fully asleep. There's little milk, but the baby roots anyway. She rocks gently, half humming, her mind already moving to the day, and another day like the one before, and the one before that. Every day, quietly. If you do, it's likely next to a baptism or a death. She might appear in a tax roll as someone's wife or in a court case. Perhaps fined for gathering firewood from the wrong forest. But mostly, she is absent from history's pages, not because she was unimportant, but because no one thought to write her down. Her children might weep, her husband might nod in silence, and then life would go on. Another woman would rise before the rooster. Another set of hands would stir the embers. The work would continue, relentlessly. Her shoulders ache from sleeping on uneven straw. Her mouth is dry. There's no such thing as a full night's rest for her. Only pauses between duties. She shifts, careful not to wake the others, and presses the child to her chest. It is here, in this quiet in-between, that we end our story not with a great event, not with an uprising or a miracle, but with a simple continuation of survival. Not because she wasn't seen, but because her labor was so constant that it became background noise. Unnoticed, expected, undervalued, because that is what medieval peasant women did. let's take a moment to reflect on her place in history. You won't find her name in the parish records, and yet, without her, there would be no bread baked, no children clothed, no hearts lit, no families tended. Historians now call her invisible labor. Even in death, she rarely received a headstone, just a simple burial, wrapped in cloth, placed beside others like her. In a morning when the stream ran clear and the sun warmed her face, she sang. She danced at harvest. She whispered stories in the dark. She knew the names of every herb in the hedgerow, and which moon was best for planting. But let's not reduce her to tragedy, because in spite of it all she endured, she found joy in small things. A child's laughter, a loaf that rose just right. She carried generations forward. She was history just, not the kind that kings and scribes wrote down. It starts as a dull throb, just a small ache in the back molar. Maybe you bit down wrong. Maybe you chewed something too hard. You shake it off. There is no mirror to check, no toothbrush, no warm salt rinse waiting on the shelf. You are a peasant in the 14th century. You have a toothache, and that simple misfortune might soon become the most painful and dangerous experience of your life. You press your tongue against it, hoping it's nothing. Tonight, we delve into one of the most quietly horrific corners of medieval life. The world of medieval dentistry, or rather, the lack of it. The medieval person, regardless of class, had one great enemy hiding in their jaw: tooth decay. And pull a tooth at night tall, with the same tools, rarely cleaned, barely sharpened. If you lived in a town, you might recognize him by the red and white striped pole symbolic of blood and bandages. You sit on a stool, and he places one hand firmly on your forehead, the other gripping your aching molar. If you lived in a village, it might simply be the man with the strongest arms and the least squeamish temperament. No precision. Teeth often break mid-extraction, splintering in the gum. Sometimes the wrong tooth is yanked. Sometimes the jaw cracks. Blood fills your mouth. Just a hole where a tooth used to be, and the hope that the fever doesn't come. You scream, or you faint, or you vomit. And unlike us, they had no reliable way to prevent it, no x-rays to detect it, and no antibiotics to treat what followed. He might pack the socket with rags, soaked in vinegar or wine, honey, dried fruits, and later, imported sugar. All contributed to rampant tooth decay in the wealthy. Some surviving medieval skulls show rows of blackened teeth, abscesses that reach the jawbone, and molars worn to the root. Then he tells you to bite down and sends you on your way. A badly decayed mouth could ruin a marriage prospect, a job, a priest's sermon, and yet, it was so common that no one was shocked. A few used chewing sticks, broken twigs frayed at one end, but most simply ignored their teeth, until pain forced them not to. Now, let's return to you. Your jaw is swollen. Her image often appeared in churches, holding a pair of tongs with a tooth and a tan image, meant to comfort, though perhaps more unsettling than intended. Rubbed talismans. The side of your face is hot to the touch. You can no longer open your mouth fully. Or brain. You will die in fever, delirium, and agony. A splinter, a bad stew, a broken molar, a cold draft in church. A foul smell leaks from the wound, and still, the pain returned. The pain radiates up to your ear and down your neck. Others suggested inhaling the steam of boiled herbs through the nose. In one German manuscript, a recipe reads, "Take a frog and hold it in the mouth until it dies. The toothache shall be drawn into the creature." In medieval Europe, your only hope is the local barbershop, the traveling tooth puller, or a very brave and very untrained relative. Yes, many peasants ate porridge, beans, and vegetables, but bread, the staple of life, was coarse and filled with grit from stone mills. Yes, powdered mouse bones were believed to reduce swelling. That meant every bite was like chewing sandpaper. Over time, it wore down enamel, created fissures, and made decay more likely. There's a sour taste in your mouth. Something is rotting inside you. You can feel it, eating, spreading. But what can you do? There are no dentists, not as we know them. The word dentist wouldn't appear in English until the 18th century. He lays out his tools on a stained wooden table. Forceps, tongs, curved hooks, and something that looks disturbingly like pliers. These men are not specialists. The barber surgeon might cut hair in the morning, lance a boil in the afternoon. Let's imagine your neighbor recommends a tooth puller. He's passing through town, sets up shop in the market square. There is no anesthetic, no numbing, no sterilization. Maybe he offers you a gulp of ale or wine if you can afford it. Maybe not. And then he pulls. There is no subtlety. He might press a bit of clove oil to the wounded numb slightly, though it won't stop infection. No aftercare. No painkillers. Let's talk about how teeth were lost in the first place. Medieval diets were not always as healthy as romantic novels suggest. Sweet foods were rare for peasants but common among nobles. Toothbrushes didn't exist. Some people rubbed their teeth with cloth or with ashes and salt. And the pain, it wasn't just physical. It was social. Rotten teeth smelled. Infected gums. Bled constantly. Swollen cheeks distorted the face. They used remedies. Oh yes, there were remedies. The herbalists and folk healers offered pastes made of ground sage, vinegar, mint, and even burnt mouse bones. Some advised placing a leech on the gum, and if all else failed, there was prayer. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, was said to protect those with tooth pain. Her own teeth had been pulled during martyrdom. People lit candles, whispered to saints. So now, let's return to you. It has been 3 days since the extraction. The swelling is worse. You have sepsis, though you don't know the word. The infection is in your bloodstream. It will travel to your heart, and no one will connect your death to the tooth that started it all. Because in the medieval world, people died all the time for reasons that seemed trivial. The molar is gone. The bleeding has slowed. The swelling remains. But you can talk again if you must. Because in medieval life, dental pain rarely ended with extraction. Most endured it for years, even decades, adapting to it, like one might to a limp or a blind eye. The difference is that this pain was always hidden until it screamed. His ink is steady, but his jaw trembles. He clenches when he sleeps. His canines are worn flat from grinding. His breath is foul. He prays to Saint Apollonia twice a day and hides his pain from the abbot. He fears being replaced. You drink broth carefully. You press a cloth to your face when the ache pulses too hard. Days pass. Then a week. And while the pain is no longer sharp, it is there a deep, hollow throb in the bone. She has 5 children, a husband who works the fields, and a mouth so full of decay that she no longer eats solid food. Its use was brutal and often fractured the jawbone. Others used hot irons to cauterize the nerve. They would slice into the gum with a sharpened reed or knife, pressing the swelling until pus drained into the mouth. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, only cloth, a bucket of cold water, and whispered prayers. Yes, they burned the tooth's root from the inside, hoping the heat would kill the pain before it killed the patient. Her molars are black. Her gums bleed every morning, and she smells faintly of pus. She ate too much candied fruit and childhood honeyed nuts and dried dates from the Levant. Her front teeth are crumbling. She applies rose water and powdered sage to her gums, hoping it will mask the odor. The infection spread inward into the sinus cavities, into the jawbone, or worse, into the brain. Without antibiotics, the body fought a losing battle. The result, jaw, death, a slow necrosis of the face, ending in fever, delirium, and suffocation. Some aristocrats paid for false teeth, made of bone, ivory, or even teeth taken from corpses. They were wired into place with metal clasps, uncomfortable, unstable, and prone to rot. Her father arranges a marriage. The groom flinches at the kiss. She presses warm claws to her cheek and chews only on the left side. She mutters apologies at the table. Her children look away. You begin to wonder, is this what healing feels like? Or is something still wrong? No fluoride. Maybe your neighbor shrugs and says her cousin had the same pain and died in his sleep. No intervention, just silence and a slow, tightening ache that pulses behind your eyes. No oral hygiene campaigns. You are expected to endure. After all, haven't others done the same? Let us now travel deeper into the lives of those who lived with pain not as an event, but as a constant companion. Let's meet a few of them, composites of real people, drawn from records, letters, and skeletons. There's Agnes, a middle-aged woman in a village outside Rouen. There's John, a monastic scribe who copies books for the priory. You wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, from dreams of cracking molars and bleeding gums. You fear the pain more than you fear death. And there is Isolde, a young noble woman with a smile that once turned heads. This was the reality. Pain was normalized. Let's now turn to treatment SIF. They can be called that. We've already seen the forceps and the public square extractions. But what if you couldn't afford that? What if you lived far from any tooth puller or barber? Then you made do. One common solution was the tooth key, a metal tool shaped like a door key, designed to hook around the tooth and twist it free. In some cases, particularly in monasteries, monks attempted drainage of abscesses. Other records describe bizarre folk remedies, applying mashed earthworms to the gum, chewing tobacco or garlic skins, tying a dead mole around the neck to draw out the rot, holding one's head over a fire, inhaling the smoke of burning henbane. And yet, sometimes, none of it helped. Let's not forget what came after a tooth was pulled. There were no dentures, no implants. If you lost your front teeth, you covered your mouth for life. The poor simply gummed their food and hoped for soft stew. Now, take a step back. Consider what dental pain does, not just to your body, but to your mind. When every bite hurts, you eat less. You grow weak. You lose weight. Your breath becomes fetid. People avoid you. You cannot sleep. And worse, no one thinks it's strange. There are no dentists to consult. Maybe the village priest tells you your pain is punishment. But there is no outrage. The jaw has stopped hurting. But not because it has healed. You stop noticing the pain the way one stops noticing the cold after a while. It becomes a background hum like the ticking of a clock you no longer hear until it stops. And by then, it's often too late. Because in a world without proper medicine, tooth pain wasn't just pain. It was a reminder that your body could betray you, that suffering might never be resolved, that sometimes all you could do was endure. Tonight, we conclude this story not with relief, but with acceptance, the quiet, bitter kind the medieval people knew well. Fetching water, stirring porridge, mending linen, until one morning she cannot get out of bed. Her tongue is swollen. She cannot swallow. Her neck is stiff. The fever has begun. By the next day, her name is no longer spoken aloud. The world moves on. Let's imagine a final case. A woman, perhaps 30 years old, already older than most village mothers. The midwife tries to place a poultice under her jordo smurry, clay, and pig fat. It doesn't help. The woman shivers and mumbles incoherently. That night, her breath slows, then stops. No sermons about brushing. No saints canonized for curing gin. She's had a persistent abscess in her lower jaw for weeks. The cheek is hot, red, and stretched tight. Pus leaks when she yawns. Her breath makes her husband turn away, but she keeps working. In Italy and France, physicians wrote tentative treatises on oral hygiene, suggesting vinegar rinses or scrapers for cleaning teeth. These were available only to the elite, of course. The neighbors murmur, jaw sickness. They've seen it before. Not to clean thoroughly, but to appear fashionable after meals. It was a start, though it came centuries too late for the countless millions who had suffered before. Worn enamel. And not until the 19th that anesthesia, hygiene, and public health finally transformed how the world approached oral care. Broken cavities deep into the root. Some show surgical attempts, ragged gaps where teeth were twisted out. Others show abscesses so severe, the jawbone warped outward. There's nothing to be done. The parish priest is called. He sprinkles holy water. In the morning, her children cry. But no one is surprised. She is buried in the churchyard. No marker, just a mound. A few neighbors offer bread. That's how tooth pain ended in the Middle Ages, not with fillings or clean bills of health, but with burial. Now, let's explore the historical silence around this. We have bones through thousands of medieval skulls unearthed by archaeologists. They tell a grim story. Nearly every adult skull shows dental trauma, but the written records, almost nothing. No medieval chronicles record someone dying of a toothache because it wasn't seen as remarkable. There were no royal decrees about oral health, and yet, these teeth tell stories louder than any scroll ever could. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, a few hopeful changes appeared. In some parts of Europe, apothecaries began experimenting with herbal rinses, clove, MR, and say, by the 16th century, wealthier nobles commissioned toothpick sets, delicate, carved, and sometimes made of silver. It would not be until the 18th century that dentistry emerged as a distinct field. Until then, pain reigned. Trumpets sound. The hall is glowing with torchlight. Laughter rings out, mingling with the clatter of goblets and the low thrum of a lute. Long trestle tables groan under the weight of roasted meats, glistening pies, steaming bread, and carved fruit. Servants rush about in linen and wool, platters balanced precariously, as the guests raise toasts to dukes and saints. You think, at first glance, you've entered paradise. You haven't. You've entered a medieval feast. And unless you are of noble birth, titled rank, or extreme cunning, you are going to leave hungry, confused, and perhaps a little ill. Because what no one tells you about medieval banquets is this. They weren't about feeding everyone. They were about showing everyone who mattered. Not because of your charm or wit, but perhaps because you're a minor knight, a clerk, or a distant cousin. A cousin of someone who once sold hay to the steward. It's been a long ride. Your boots are muddy. You step into the castle's great hall, expecting food. And there is food. Sort of afterward. It may be thrown to the dogs, or the poor, or you. Let's begin at the very core. The illusion of abundance. Pheasant served with his feathers reattached. Eel pie. To sit above the salt was an honor. To sit below the salt meant you were tolerated, but not quite welcome. Almond stuffed trout. Peacock dyed with saffron. You eat your stew. You pretend to enjoy it, and you watch. You might be removed by the steward, or flogged for overstepping your place. Spiced wine. Pies open to release live birds, yes. That nursery rhyme was real. These were not practical meals. They were edible theater. You clap. You didn't always eat. 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. They weren't baked, they were enclosed alive to fly out and startle the guests. Entertainers roamed the hall. Jugglers, fools, musicians, even dancing bears. But perhaps the most absurd performances came on the plate itself. Always offer the best portion to your neighbor. By the time the food reached you, it was often cold, greasy, and picked over. That's right, people were employed to preach you hot bites and hand feed their masters. You, of course, had to serve yourself. If the stew was hot, you burned your tongue. It all looked grand, but very little of it tasted good. And even less was meant for you. You're invited to a feast, whispered about, laughed at later. Your name may not be on the guest list next time. Bread was often hard, baked with coarse flour that scratched the gums, and fruit, though the wine. You could not begin eating until the Lord had tasted his dish. You could not wipe your mouth with your sleeve. You could not put your elbows on the table, chew with your mouth open, or speak while chewing. Often sour. The ale, cloudy. You arrive hungry. Who got what and when and how much was never about hunger. It was about power. But here's the first problem. You don't get any of it. Roasted swan. Behind them are their stewards, chaplains, and senior knight. Further down are the lesser clergy, minor nobles, and only then the fringes of the room are you seated. If you're lucky, it all looks spectacular. The finest dishes go to the high table, where the lord and lady sit, flanked by honored guests, and your plate, boiled barley, maybe a turnip stew, a slab of stale bread used as a trench or not a plate, but a slice of coarse loaf, meant to soak up juices. Feasts were designed with hierarchy baked in. Service began from the top. First course, to the high table. Second course if anything remained to the middle rows. And seating mattered just as much the closer you were to the salt salera, literal dish of salt placed near the lord the higher your status. You were seen, you were not fed well. And if you thought of getting up and snatching something better from the plate, don't. That would have been scandalous, perhaps punishable. So you sit. Let's talk about the theatrics of the meal. A medieval feast wasn't just about food, it was about spectacle. Cooks shaped meat into the likeness of castles. Some feasts served meat in Frankensteinian fashion, a pig's head stuffed with smaller birds, a rooster sewn onto a lamb, glazed in saffron until unrecognizable. And even when food reached you, it wasn't guaranteed to be edible. There was no refrigeration. The meat spoiled fast. Fish especially, if not caught nearby, might be salted beyond recognition. Spices masked rot. And yet, all of it served with ceremony. Carvers slicing with ritual. Servants bowing low. Entire animals wheeled out on platters of pewter or wood. Now, consider the etiquette. The rules of a medieval feast were strict and often you were to break your bread, not bite it. Use 3 fingers, not all 5. Wipe your knife before passing it. The nobility often had servants to chew or cool their food before eating it. But etiquette wasn't just about manners, it was about proving you belonged. And most guests failed. One misstepper, slurp a cough, a drop trencherand, you were marked. So here you are, seated far from the high table, gnawing stale bread, watching a juggler toss torches while a peacock stuffed with eel is paraded by on a silver dish never to touch your hands. And that's when it hits you. This isn't a meal, it's a message. It says, look what we can afford. Look who gets fed. Look where you sit. Because in the medieval world, eating was political. You're still seated on the outer bench. The minstrels have struck up another tune, something plucky and quick, meant to distract from the fact that no one at your end of the table has eaten in over an hour. The smell of roasted meat lingers, tantalizing but distant. A boar's head, mouth stuffed with apples and rosemary, passes you on its way to the high table. You can see the steam rising. You can almost taste the crackling skin. But you will never get a bite. Welcome back to the medieval feast, a place where pageantry devours practicality, where class swallows appetite, and where you, the unimportant guest, sit both seen and starved. Let us now step beyond the great hall and explore what the feast really meant to the people who staged the mand, what it cost. A marriage arranged, a treaty signed, a military victory won, and pour out barrels of wine without blinking. Then he was clearly wealthy, blessed, and in charge. You might go home with an empty belly, but your eyes would be full of awe. That was the point. Records show over 200 pigs, 14 oxen, 120 sheep, hundreds of gallons of wine, and dozens of swans. It was lavish. It was legendary. Then it was time for a feast. Feasts were tools of power. They were held not because people were hungry, but because the Lord needed to show dominance, generosity, and control all in one dramatic event. Some of this was fed to dogs. Some was given to servants. Some, if you were lucky, was distributed to the poor after the feast. They didn't eat it. If you were hoping for scraps, you had to wait by the kitchen doors, bowl in hand, watching dishes disappear into the darkness, hoping something edible made it your way. Was a child born, the bigger, the better. Let's say you're outside, here in the feast, smelling it, but not invited. But make no mistake, the food that reached them was not the boar's head or the sugared almonds. It was the slop, and the message was always the same. Look at what I can give away, without feeling the loss. Feast or not, they had 2 milk cows, gather wood, and patch roofs. No one was going to bring them a trencher of meat stew. No one announced, "Come all the villagers. There's more than enough." A medieval village might have 200 souls, lavish ones, not to help the hungry, but to prove their immunity to hardship. A noble feast might invite 30. Feasts sometimes lasted days. The kitchen fire never went out. Cooks slept in shifts. Girls washed dishes until their hands bled. The spit boys turned the roasting pig for hours in unbearable heat. You've been here 5 hours. The dancing has begun. The wine has made the nobles louder, and the best food is gone. A servant walks by with a dish of honeyed walnuts. He glances at you. You reach out just a little. He turns away. The rest, they were fed separately, after service, and only if food remained. If the feast was over budget, the kitchen starved first. They watched the carriages arrive. They heard the laughter. They smelled the roast from the outer courtyard. And they kept working. If a noble could slaughter a whole ox, roast 24 birds. Even kings used this strategy. In 1387, Richard II of England threw a feast where thousands of guests were served across multiple days. Or rather, there was enough, just not for them, and most attendees still only saw the food. Because for the majority of guests, especially those from outside the noble circle, feasting was a performance, not a meal. Let's now consider what was done with leftovers. The idea being, give the people enough spectacle, and they won't revolt, even if they starve. Here lies one of the great contradictions of the medieval banquet. You might starve while food spoiled behind the kitchen door. High-table guests were served course after course. They rarely finished anything. Entire plates were cleared between rounds and carried back to the kitchens. But that depended on the host. Some lords were proud of their charity. Others were wasteful or paranoid. Even if food was given out, it was often the cool, congealed remnants of the upper tables. Gristle, marrow, crusted sauces, and meat already picked over by fingers ringed in gold. In fact, this system of redistributing leftovers became so entrenched that some towns created almoners, officials tasked with receiving and passing out feast scraps to the local poor. Now let's imagine you're not even inside the hall. This was the case for the majority of people, because for them, hunger was daily, because there wasn't. And that leads us to a cruel irony. Feasts occurred during scarcity, after a bad harvest, after plague. Even during wartime, lords still held feasts. There's a Latin phrase used by medieval chroniclers, panem et circenses, in this way. The medieval feast was both a distraction and a declaration. Let's take a moment now to look at who really worked hardest during these events. The kitchen staff scullions, spit boys, bakers, meat carvers, and washerwomen were awake long before dawn. And none of them ate well. So, now you're seated, slumped, and hungry. You lick your fingers. They're still greasy from the barley stew you had hours ago. And you realize something strange. Despite the food, the music, the costumes, and the silver goblet stew, have never felt more aware of your poverty. That, too, was part of the design. The candles have burned low. The minstrels pack up their instruments. A few guests slump drunkenly on benches, and the servants begin the slow work of scraping grease from the stone floors. The great hall smells of wine, meat, fat, sweat, and soot. You haven't eaten an hour. You were invited. Yes, but invitation did not mean inclusion. You witnessed the bounty. You tasted the broth. You drank watered ale from a chipped cup. You clapped politely as dishes paraded by. And now, you leave the feast no fuller than you arrived. The speed at which your food arrived, the number of courses you received, it all conveyed your place in the world. But the feeling you carry out is not just hunger. It's something heavier, something that stays long after the food is gone. Let us now explore the long shadow of feasting, how the ritual of eating in the medieval world wasn't about food, but about enforcing social order so enduring that it shaped generations. You see, the feast wasn't only a party, it was a display of hierarchy. It told everyone where they stood, not just physically at the table, but spiritually. economically, and politically. The distance from the salt cellar. One who reached without permission could be called ambitious or dangerous. One who failed to attend entirely might be seen as and these details were remembered. They might be in the kitchen or outside, tending animals, preparing for cleanup, or caring for children. Dishes were arranged to mimic the number of apostles or the structure of heaven. They experienced the feast only through labor, not indulgence. Play poorly, and you might never be invited again. To question the feast was to question the order of things. Better to eat your crust quietly and thank God you were there at all. A guest who ate too quickly might be labeled a glutton. They sat apart. The floor itself might slope toward the entrance, giving the illusion that guests became lower the further from the Lord they sat. Their portions were smaller. Often, they were expected to serve rather than dine. They had to eat delicately, slowly, and never too much. The feast was a stage, and you had to perform your role. Others on foot, you walk. The night is cold, and your stomach growls. Behind you, the castle windows glow faintly. Laughter drifts on the wind. Now let's talk about gender, another quiet divider. Women, especially noble women, were rarely allowed to eat freely at feasts. You consider offering him the leftover crust in your pocket, but you don't. To be seen enjoying food was considered unseemly for a lady. Appetite was equated with desire, and desire, in women, was dangerous. You think of roasted swan, jeweled pies, silver goblets, and golden bread. You dream not of flavor, but of status. Peasant women, meanwhile, were likely not in the hall at all. Let's pause again and consider faith. Religious symbolism ran deep through these meals. Feasts marked holy days, Michaelmas, Easter, Epiphany, and each course was laden with Christian meaning. Fish on Fridays, no meat during Lent. And yet, for all this piety, the gluttony of the elite stood in contrast to the fasting of the poor. Medieval sermons often condemned overindulgence while nobles chewed sweetmeats beside the altar. The contradiction was known, but no one spoke of it aloud. Even the architecture of the feast told a story. Tables were arranged in a U or T shape. The Lord sat elevated under a canopy. Everyone else looked upward later to see who ruled them. Feasting halls often had raised dais platforms, symbolic thrones, and decorative tapestries, celebrating ancient heroes or biblical kings. It was a place where power didn't just sit, it performed. Now, let's step outside the hall. The feast is over. Some guests leave in carriages. You pass a beggar sitting on the roadside. He wasn't invited. He smelled of dung and mildew. You're still hungry yourself. You lie down that night thinking not of what you ate, but of what you saw others eat. And that is what the medieval feast did best. It didn't satisfy hunger. It transformed it. It turned your empty stomach into a symbol, one that reminded you where you stood and how far you still were from the Lord's table. It starts with a door, heavy, iron-bound, carved into the side of a castle's lowest wall. You're pushed through it, rough hands on your back, a voice barking orders. It slams shut behind you, sealing out the last sliver of daylight. You hear the bolt scrape into place. The torch disappears up the stairs. And then silence. No, what awaits you is worse. A forgotten hole where time stretches, light fades, and the body decays by inches. Tonight, we enter the cold, damp belly of medieval justice. A place where death doesn't come quickly, but waits patiently, week by week. Inside, stone and rot. You are now in the dungeon. Few were designed with comfort or even visibility in mind. No windows, no airflow, no drainage. Moisture seeped through the stones year-round. Rats made their homes in the corners. So did fleas and lice, and the screams of those who came before. A wooden bucket in the corner, your only toilet. No lights except the cracks around the door. No bedding, no fire. If you're less lucky, you'll hear the bells toll for mass, and that's the only clue you'll have to time passing. Not the dramatic torture chamber of films and legends, Welcome to the medieval dungeon. Most were simply storage spaces, places to store human bodies, the way one might store sacks of grain. Out of sight, out of mind. Offended and noble, or maybe you were accused, with no proof needed. In many places, trial by jury came after imprisonment, not before. There might be someone else in the cell, a thief, a deserter, a political prisoner. They do not speak much. The hunger dulls everything. Conversation, anger, even the need to scream. Let's see how long you'd last. First, let's clear up a myth. Most medieval dungeons were not used for elaborate torture. They were not chambers of spikes and worry wheels. In winter, frost gathers on the walls. Your clothes are damp and torn. You cannot dry them. You cannot remove them. You wear your filth until your skin breaks beneath it, until they faded from records, from memory, from life. You are not important enough to save. Your life is worth less than the lock on the door. These dungeons were often repurposed cellars, guard towers, or underground cities. He unlocks the door if he needs to drag you out. Sometimes, a local man is punished by being given power, but only over the weakest. He might offer a kind word, or not. In some places, jailers were unpaid. They lived off the fees they could squeeze from prisoners. The man beside you is coughing too. He's been coughing for days. You think it's the plague, or dysentery, or just a dungeon settling in. No calendar. Your fingernails grow long. Your hair is infested with lice. Your muscles atrophy. Your feet rot in your boots. You scratch sores into your skin and watch them ooze. Let's describe your cell. Other prisoners, or perhaps memories. Rough stone walls, maybe 8 feet by 6. The floor is dirt or flagstone, covered with straw that's never been changed. To yourself, if the jailer likes you, he'll pass along scraps from his table. If he doesn't, you'll go days on mold and rats. If you're lucky, there's a tiny barred window high up the wall, too small to reach, but enough to let you know when it's day. And you are not alone. You may be shackled to the wall by the ankle. Not because you'll escape, but because it's protocol. Let's talk about why you're here. You could have stolen bread, missed a tax payment. You want your chains loosened? Fee. You do not want to be beaten for amusement. Fee. Imprisonment wasn't seen as a punishment in itself. It was a holding pattern while the real punishment, execution, exile, or mutilation was decided. So the dungeon wasn't your sentence. It was the pause between chapters. And sometimes, that pause lasted forever. Some prisoners were forgotten entirely. No one paid their fines. No one returned to advocate for them. And so they stayed. Now let's focus on the conditions. You are cold. There are no blankets. You are hungry. Food comes once a day, if a crust of bread, a ladle of watery gruel, maybe beans, maybe nothing. You are sick. Your teeth ache. Your gums bleed. You cough. And each time it feels deeper. There is no medicine. No priests come to check on you. Let's talk about the jailer. He is your only link to the world above. He brings your food if he remembers. You want water? That's a fee. You want to send a letter? Fee. If you have no money, you are at the jailer's mercy. And mercy is in short supply. In some regions, the jailer was a drunk. In others, a failed soldier. He might forget you're here. He might remember just long enough to spit in your food. No, we imagine the passing of time. No sunlight. Sometimes you hear screams faint through the walls. You dream of bread, of warmth, of a door opening. Sometimes you wish the executioner would come already. And sometimes you start talking to the rats, to the wall. Because in the dungeon, the mind breaks long before the body does. You no longer know how long you've been here. The days blur together, or perhaps they don't. Time doesn't pass in the dungeon. It accumulates. One morning, if it was morning, you woke and found him very still. He's still there. No one's come to remove him. In your joints, in your teeth, in the walls. The man who used to cough in the corner has gone quiet. You tried to speak to him once. He didn't answer. But you've stopped looking at him because the dungeon teaches you this. There is no room for grief when hunger sits beside you. One has fallen out. You chew on the left side now, and only when the food is soft. You've learned not to chew too eagerly because another broken tooth means another wave of fever. Let's examine what happens to the body during long-term confinement. Not in an abstract sense. In your sense, your legs have lost their strength. You cannot walk without wobbling. Your calves have withered. Your shoulders are curved forward. Every movement feels like lifting a stone. Your teeth are loose. Your nails have curled like hooks. You scratch constantly not because you itch, but because the body craves any sensation beyond the cold. Your skin smells of mildew, copper, and old fear, and your eyes, they've changed. You flinch at torchlight now, and then, one day, when someone finally speaks to you again, you flinch at the sound of your name. A world where people walk freely and speak in normal tones. You can't quite remember how that feels, but the reeve may have forgotten your face. And so you remain. You're a peasant. No appeals. No formal sentencing procedures in most localities. A tenant. A nobody. The dungeon dims your vision, both outward and inward. When a jailer opens the door, it feels like looking into a second world. A drop of water hitting stone, again and again. Sometimes, footsteps. He speaks gently, as if you are a patient and not a prisoner. He offers absolution. He tells you you'll soon be with God. One 14th century French account speaks of a man in prison so long, his feet molded to the stones he'd sat on. Sometimes screams, but mostly stillness. Let's talk about the noises. There are a few, and that makes them unbearable. The scratching of rats, the distant clink of chains, quietly, of starvation, of infected wounds, of madness, of despair. But for the least of oppressed or broken on the wheel, or if your crime warranted, you listen for things that may not exist. Breathing, whispers, your thoughts. The absence of noise becomes a kind of companion. That is, if you still have one. Let's speak now of the lore. What passed for it? Some weren't buried at all, just left until someone needed the cell. You might ask, how long can they keep me here? The answer is simple. As long as they want. In many medieval courts, justice was slow or selective. Nobles could bribe their way out. Merchants might pay fines. Priests claimed sanctuary. You were accused of something. That's enough. The records might be lost. The steward might be dead. There were no prisoners' rights. In some regions, people rotted for decades in these places. He was never tried. He was simply forgotten. His bones are in the corner. His blood dried on the floor. His name was scratched into the wall. You sit, and you begin scratching your own. Let's look at the rare moments when the door opens. Sometimes it's the jailer. Sometimes a guard. Sometimes a priest. Ah, the priest. He comes not to free you, but to hear your confession. That's how you know your end is near. He brings oil, Latin words, and sometimes a small wafer. And when he leaves, you hear the rattle of chains again, because it is not your soul being saved. It's your neck. Executions followed their calendar. You might be hanged, but many prisoners never made it to the platform. They've died in their cells. Their bodies were removed at night. No funerals, just shallow graves or river dumps. That, too, was common. A new prisoner arrives at a cell not fully cleaned of the last man. You see this, and here's a cruel twist. Not everyone in the dungeon was guilty. False accusations, political imprisonments, debt, bad luck. Some men and women entered as victims and exited as corpses, because in a world where survival was a privilege and justice was a game of favors, the dungeon became a place not for the worst. You no longer flinch when the door creaks open. You don't rise. You don't beg. You don't speak. You've forgotten how to plead. You've forgotten what your voice sounds like. You wait, but it's not your name they call it. And so the jailer leaves. The door groans shut, and the darkness is yours again your most loyal companion, because now you are no longer simply a prisoner. You are part of the dungeon itself. In this final section, let us understand what the dungeon left behind, not just in the people who entered it, but in history itself. They take photographs. They make nervous jokes. Dungeons were not places people wrote about, unless they had escaped them. And even then, the records were rare, fragmented, and often unreliable. The people who entered dungeons weren't chroniclers or kings. They were peasants, rebels, servants, petty criminals, unlucky travelers. But what we do have, what has survived, is the stone. In castles across Europe, the dungeons remain. Tourists walk past the rusted hinges, the moss-streaked walls, and the narrow shafts of light. But the stone remembers. It holds the fingerprints of chained ankles, the carved names of men who wanted to be remembered, the stains that will never be washed out. In the Bastille, before its fall, prisoners were stacked so tightly in cells that they stood to sleep. In the shadowed Diff, off the French coast, the salt air couldn't hide the rot. The grooves were where someone scratched days, then weeks, then months, because the prisoners within were never meant to come out. Then stopped, unchecked, and used with a cold practicality. In the Tower of London, there are still etchings made by prisoners, drawn with nails or spoons. And in smaller, forgotten castles, across France, Germany, and Italy where no tourists go, there are cells with no doors. Now let's consider the philosophy behind these places. Why build a dungeon if death was the end goal? Because the dungeon was not about punishment. Alone it was about power without mercy. It said, "You've forgotten how to walk evenly. You stumble into the daylight like a revenant. We can take your body and place it in a space where no one hears you. You are the one who is kept. You speak slowly. You sleep poorly. You trust no one. We can remove you from the world without needing to explain why. And even if you survive, we decide when you return." This power was absolute. Dungeons didn't exist to rehabilitate. They existed to erase. Let's talk about what happened after. Suppose, somehow, you were released. The carving of your name in the wall proof that you existed. Maybe your fine was paid. Maybe your accuser died. Maybe the jailer took pity. You emerge, blinking, hunched, and silent. Your skin is pale. Your joints are stiff, but you don't return to the life you had. Because that life is gone. Friends have moved on. The family may be dead. Your plot of land, reassigned. Your good name, forgotten. You are marked not by scars, but by silence. You carry the dungeon with you, and it stays. And yet, even in these lowest corners of medieval life, some small slivers of light broke through. A guard who smuggled in bread, a monk who whispered comfort, a fellow prisoner who taught you a psalm. Sometimes that was enough, because even in darkness, the human spirit looks for one last thing to hold on to. The belief that someone, someday, might know you were here. You rise before the sun. Not because you're eager, but because you must. You have 70 miles to travel. No horse, no maps, and no guarantee you'll arrive in one piece. You tighten your cloak, check your pack, say a silent prayer to St. Christopher, and step out into the morning fog. It's the 13th century, and you are about to learn a truth, seldom sung by minstrels or scribes. To travel in the Middle Ages was not brave. It was miserable. It is not straight. It is a deep rut, carved by cart wheels and hooves, now hardened into rock in some places, turned to mud in others. Water collects in hollows. Roots trip your steps. There are no signs, no markers. The path forks without warning, and you hope the direction you chose leads somewhere that speaks your language or at least shares your religion. And now, you walk dangerous. If the river is shallow, you wade through it. If not, you wait for a ferryman if one exists. If he's sober, and if he doesn't decide your coin purse would be better in his pocket. Dirty, and often completely unnecessary until it became unavoidable. Most are attached to monasteries, where hospitality is offered but grudgingly, and only for a night or two. pilgrims get priority. You, with no badge or parchment, might be turned away. They are little more than leather socks, thin-soled, tied with twine. By midday, the blisters have already begun to bubble under trees, in roadside chapels, where mice crawl over your blanket, or in the open, where you pray. The moon is your only company. Most don't speak. Some don't look up. Everyone assumes you might be a thief. You wouldn't travel unless you had to. A dying parent, a pilgrimage, a summons from court, or a debt you couldn't outrun. A skin, a veil, maybe a few dried figs, if you're lucky. Let us take the first few painful miles together. They are desperate men, often former soldiers or vagrants, armed with clubs or knives, waiting just beyond the hedge. The road, if it can be called, that is not paved. Some in groups. Every step is through mud laced with human and animal waste. There is no sanitation. Your hands are never clean. Your food is rarely washed. They strike quickly. They want your boots, your food, and your cloak. If you resist, they may take more. Your shoes are not made for walking. There are no bridges here, only fords. Just the same mud, the same silence, the same uncertainty. And if it's raining, you keep walking, because stopping in the wild means lying on damp ground, surrounded by fleas, hungry dogs, and worse. You walk until your legs burn, your eyes blur, and you begin to hallucinate the warmth of a hearth that isn't there. Let's now consider what you carry. Your bag hand-stitched lumpiers filled with bread so stale it could hammer nails. A bit of cheese wrapped in linen, a linen cloth to be buried in, just in case. No music or conversation beyond the birds and the wind. You walk for hours without seeing another soul. You begin talking to yourself, counting steps, imagining food, fantasizing about boots that don't hurt, wondering if the next bend in the road will bring a town or a wolf. There are no inns every 5 miles, no roadside taverns with cold drinks and warm meals. A medieval inn is rare, expensive, and often full. So you sleep where you can, in barns, if a kindly farmer allows it. Now, let's talk about who you meet on the road. Other travelers are suspicious, because the real danger is bandits. They are not outlaws in leather armor or romantic highwaymen with gallant charm. Some act alone. Even worse, sometimes it's guards who rob you. Yes, there were toll keepers and patrols, but many were corrupted collecting bribes, inventing fees, or simply deciding that your pack might serve them better than you. Let's talk now about disease. You share the road with pigs, oxen, rotting carts, and open wounds. If you scrape your ankle, you may limp the rest of the journey or worse, die days later from an infection you don't even understand. And what if you become feverish? There are no hospitals, no inns. With physicians, the best you can hope for is a local herb wife who offers you a foul-smelling poultice and tells you to sleep facing east. Most travelers carried their shrouds with them because many never returned. And now, let's consider the psychological toll, the loneliness of it. There are no crowds, no streetlights. You think of turning back, but there's nothing back there either. Let us close this section with a quiet question, one that every medieval traveler likely asked before the blisters, before the bandits, before the bitter ale. It's been 2 weeks. You've walked through woods and bogs, over crumbling bridges, and across frozen fields. Your shoes are now scraps. Your cloak is infested with lice. Your pack has lost its shape. You smell of rot, mud, wet wool, and a faint sourness that even animals shy away from. You haven't seen a friendly face in days, and yet your destination is near. A walled city rises in the distance, wrapped in morning mist. You've made it, or so you think, because the hardest part of medieval travel wasn't always getting there. It was what awaited you when you arrived. Let's pause now and understand what it meant to reach your destination in the Middle Ages. You are footsore, hungry, and weak. You expect a warm bed, a welcomed relief. Instead, you are treated with suspicion. The gatekeepers ask where you've come from. Do you carry goods, money, plague? In many cities, travelers were required to pay a gate fee to enter unless vouched for. You are not. You have no letter of introduction, no badge, no seal. They inspect your pack, your face, your shoes, shouting merchants, pickpockets, foreign tongues, dogs bark, children chase carts. You try to smile, but your lips are cracked and bleeding. They let you in, but just barely. Smaller. You're jostled as you walk. No one cares that you've come 70 miles on foot. The position had been filled. The message no longer mattered. No one notices that you haven't eaten today. Inside the city, things are no easier. The streets are narrow and choked with refuse. Others tried to barter or joined pilgrims at local chapels for bread and ale. You feel disoriented. You find the inn you were told of. You knock. The road back is worse. A surly woman looks you over and asks for a coin up front. You hesitate. She shuts the door. But at least it's dry. You knock again. This time, she agrees, but only if you share a room with 5 other men. All strangers. You accept. You sleep on a pallet stuffed with hay. One of your bunkmates coughs into your face. The air smells of damp bread and mildew. Now let's talk about what happens after the journey. You came here for a reason. Maybe to visit a sick relative. Maybe to deliver a message. Maybe for work. But often, when medieval travelers reached their goal, they found the situation had changed. The relative had died. Or worse, the person you needed to find had left days earlier, traveling back along the very road you took. And now, with no money, no purpose, and no support, you are stranded in a city that doesn't want you. Some stayed, some begged, some found day labor, hauling goods, or scrubbing floors, and some turned back. Let's now examine what it meant to return. You thought the road here was bad. Your body is worn. Your supplies are fewer. The route is unfamiliar now because your memory was dulled by exhaustion the first time. You get lost. You misstep. You fall ill. Many never made it back. And for those who did, they arrived changed physically and mentally. Medieval travel aged you, hardened you, or hollowed you. Some came home and never spoke of what they saw. Others became travelers again by force or by trade. And some, even after everything, walked again, because here lies the strangest truth of all. Despite the blisters, the bandits, the bad ale, the hunger, the disease, the suspicion, the cold, the pain, people still traveled. Why? Because they had to. Not because they were adventurous, but because medieval life was so brittle, so rigid, so isolating. Sometimes the only path forward was quite literally a path, a road full of suffering, because staying put, for many, meant staying forgotten. It's been 3 days since you started walking. You've crossed a stream so cold it numbed your feet for hours. You've eaten nothing but dried barley and a shriveled apple. Your boots, if you still have them, are splitting at the seams. One toe bleeds, and your thighs burn with each step from muscles long unused. Still, you press on, because turning back means starting this misery over. And today, there's a new threat. Rain. The medieval world did not have waterproofs. No go. You consider lying beneath a tree and waiting for morning, but you know that sleep, in this condition, might be your last act. No ponchos. Your cloak is wool. It holds water like a sponge. You're under tunic, soaked. Your shoulders sag under the weight of wet fabric. Every step squelches. Your bread dissolves. Your pack leaks. Your hands are numb. And the road, what little road there is, has become a swamp. Wagon stalls. Donkeys sink. Shoes are sucked into the mud and lost forever. There are no drainage ditches, no culverts, only pools that hide rocks and thorns. You fall once, then again. By nightfall, your clothes are freezing, your lips crack, your nails are blue. So you walk and walk until a lantern appears in the distance. But it's something. You knock on a door. It opens an inch. A suspicious face. mostly broth, with a few floating beans or shreds of cabbage. If meat is present, it will be goat or squirrels, or a part of an animal, best not identified. You ask for shelter. They close it again. Ale is warm, and both are safer than water. You've reached a village. It isn't much. A few thatched roofs, smoke from chimneys, a barking dog. Always. If it gave you cramps, you thanked God it wasn't worse. Even if it was cloudy, even if it tasted sour, even if it made you sick, collapsing riverbanks, sudden storms, falling branches, snake bites, unmarked wells, no roadside assistance, no one is coming to help quicksand. You knock on another. A woman looks you up and down, says nothing, points to the barn. You thank her, and for the first time in days, you sleep under a roof with cows. The straw smells of dung. The hay is damp, but you are grateful until the fleas wake you. In some regions, it was sacred, especially for pilgrims or clergy. But for the average traveler, especially one who looked poor or suspicious, hospitality was a risk. Messengers dashed between manors with royal seals in hand. Let's pause here to talk about hospitality. In the medieval world, hospitality wasn't a guarantee. You might be turned away. You might be overcharged. You might be robbed in your sleep. And even if you were welcomed, you were expected to contribute with coin, or labor, or prayer. Few could afford to give without receiving. So each night was a gamble. Sleep inside and risk betrayal. Sleep outside and risk exposure. Now let's talk about food. If you have money and the tavern exists, you might buy a bowl of stew. It will be thin. The bread is stale, because medieval water, unless from a fresh spring or well, was often contaminated by animal waste, human waste, dead birds, or worse. Ale was boiled during brewing. It killed some of the disease. So travelers drank ale. Some inns stretched their ale supply by watering it down. Others let it spoil in the cask. And you drank it anyway. Let's now consider accidents. Travel was dangerous, not just from violence or exposure, but from sheer misfortune. Broken bridges. If you tripped and twisted your ankle miles from shelter, you didn't limp home. You crawled. If your pack fell into a river, it was gone. If your horse threw you, you lay in the mud and prayed. You hadn't cracked something fatal. There was no ambulance. You helped yourself or you didn't. And yet, travelers kept traveling. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to shrines. Merchants carted goods through mountain passes. Scholars rode from monastery to university. Why? Because the road, for all its horrors, was also the only path to something more. To trade, to salvation, to reunion, to discover. Each step was a burden, but it also brought you closer to meaning. And for some, meaning was worth the blisters.